In the week after Lehman Brothers collapsed in September 2008, American households lost an estimated $1.2 trillion in a single day. Not over a quarter, not over a year, one Tuesday. That number is too large to feel. So stop trying to feel it as a number. Think about it this way instead. Somewhere in that single day, a pension fund manager was selling shares of a company he privately believed was worth twice what he was selling it for. Not because he was wrong about the company, because he had no choice. His fund was bleeding cash, his clients were panicking, and the only way to meet redemptions was to sell the things he could sell, not the things he wanted to sell. He was liquidating his best assets to cover his worst decisions, and on the other side of that trade, someone was buying. Now, as that gap between the person forced to sell and the person positioned to buy is where wealth transfers in a crisis. It is not complicated. It has never been complicated. But understanding the gap intellectually and being on the right side of it when it opens are two completely different things. And the distance between those two things is the subject of what follows. 3 centuries of financial crises produce the same basic structure, over and over. The crowd moves. A smaller group watches the crowd move. And somewhere inside that smaller group, an even smaller number of people are doing something that looks, from the outside, like either supreme confidence or total recklessness. They are buying, not everything, not blindly. They are running a decision tree that most people never learn exists. What separates the buyers from the sellers in every one of these crises is not courage. It is not special genius. It is something more boring and more useful than either of those things. It is preparation, and specifically, a kind of preparation that most people never make, because it requires thinking about crisis before crisis arrives. The first case worth understanding takes place in June of 1815. Europe had been at war, on and off, for over 2 decades. Napoleon was still loose. The British bond market, consols as they were called, government paper paying a fixed coupon, had been moving up and down for 20 years in lockstep with battlefield news. A British victory sent them up. A French advance sent them down. For professional financiers of that era, the bond market was essentially a real-time prediction market on the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars, and the single most valuable asset anyone could possess was information faster than the crowd. Nathan Rothschild had spent years building exactly that. By 1815, the London branch of the Rothschild family had a private courier network, relay horses, dedicated ships, agents at channel ports that moved news from the continent to London faster than any government dispatch rider. This was not luck. It was infrastructure, built deliberately, maintained at cost, for precisely this kind of moment. When his agents brought word of Wellington's victory at Waterloo on the night of June 19th, a full day before the government's official messenger arrived, Rothschild faced a decision. He knew the outcome of the most consequential battle in a generation. The rest of the market did not. And here is where the story gets more interesting than the legend suggests. According to historical research, including work from the Rothschild archive itself, what happened next was not the theatrical move often described. Rothschild had, in fact, been holding large gold reserves in anticipation of a prolonged war. The sudden peace threatened to strand those reserves at a loss. The real move was less dramatic and more instructive. He bought British government bonds after Waterloo, not through trickery, but through the calculated confidence that a lasting peace would lift the price of British government paper. He was right. By 1817, those bonds had appreciated by roughly 40%. The mini-payoff here is this. Rothschild's edge was not the information itself. It was what the information allowed him to evaluate. Whether the assets now being avoided by a frightened market had real underlying value or not. Information without a framework for using it is just noise. What he had was both. That framework is the thread worth tracking across all three of these cases. Not what they bought, how they decided what was worth buying. 4 crises are documented recurring across the 19th century in the United States alone. The panics of 1857, 1873, 1893, and the one that sits at the end of that sequence and dwarfs the rest. October of 1907. Keep that number in mind as this pattern develops. By the time the Panic of 1907 began, J.P. Morgan was 70 years old and had largely retired from active Wall Street practice. He was attending a church convention in Richmond, Virginia, when word reached him that New York's trust companies were in freefall. Depositors were withdrawing cash in waves. Several of the city's largest financial institutions were hours from collapse. There was no Federal Reserve. There was no government backstop. There was, functionally, one man in America with the network, the capital, and the institutional memory to hold the system together. And he was at a church meeting. He returned to New York on the night of Saturday, October 19th, and by Sunday morning, his brownstone library at Madison Avenue had become an emergency triage center. Trust company presidents arrived one after another, books in hand, begging for help. And here is where Morgan's decision tree becomes visible in the historical record. He did not save everyone. He could not have. More than that, he chose not to. His first move was not to flood the system with liquidity. It was to assess which institutions were insolvent, genuinely broken, beyond rescue, liabilities exceeding any reasonable valuation of assets, and which were merely illiquid, sound businesses temporarily unable to meet panicked withdrawals. That distinction sounds technical. It was not. It was the entire game. The Knickerbocker Trust, one of New York's largest, came to Morgan asking for support. He reviewed the books and declined. The Knickerbocker failed. The Trust Company of America came next. Morgan examined its assets, concluded the underlying business was sound, and organized a pool of loans to keep it open through the following day. It survived. What Morgan was doing, across a series of all-night sessions in his library, with groups of bankers he reportedly locked in until they agreed to contribute, was running an asset quality screen under extreme time pressure, in real time, with lives and fortunes on the line. The modern mirror is sitting in your brokerage account right now. When markets fall sharply, the sell-off is not uniform. Stocks of genuinely broken businesses fall alongside stocks of temporarily distressed but fundamentally sound ones. The crowd cannot tell the difference in the moment, or more precisely, the crowd does not try. Morgan tried, every time. That was the work. Not all crises resolve this cleanly, and not all operate on the same timeline. Some freeze assets for days, some for years. The Panic of 1907 was uncomfortable, but relatively brief. Within months, the system had restabilized. What came later, in 1929, was categorically different in scale and duration. The people who rebuilt from 1907 and the people who rebuilt from the Great Depression made different journeys at different speeds. Treating those experiences as interchangeable misreads the historical record. What they share is the underlying structure of the decision point, not the severity of the outcome. Which brings us to the third case, and the one that most people who study this pattern get wrong. Here is where the script needs to pause. Because if you have been following the pattern, information advantage in 1815 is asset quality triage in 1907, you might have arrived at a comfortable conclusion. The people who do well in crises are the ones with better information or better analytical frameworks, or both. And that conclusion is not wrong. It is just the first layer of a deeper answer. September 23, 2008. Lehman Brothers had been bankrupt for 8 days. The global financial system was in genuine freefall. Goldman Sachs, one of the most sophisticated financial institutions on Earth, needed to raise capital fast. They called Warren Buffett. What Buffett did in that phone call is worth examining carefully because it reveals something the first two cases only implied. He did not simply agree to invest. He negotiated the terms of his investment with precision. $5 billion in preferred shares, and paying a 10% annual dividend. Plus warrants, the right to buy additional Goldman common stock at a fixed price. The structure meant he would be paid handsomely if Goldman survived, and protected if it declined. He was not buying the same Goldman that everyone else could buy on the open market. He was buying a Goldman that no panicked retail investor had access to. 3 years later, Berkshire Hathaway had earned $3.7 billion from the investment. The warrants he received eventually converted into equity worth billions more. Now here is the reversal. Most people tell this story as proof that Buffett had the courage to buy when others were selling. That framing is true. It is also the least important part of the lesson. The more important question is, why did Goldman call Buffett? Why not someone else? The answer is that Buffett had spent decades building a specific kind of financial credibility, a public track record so well established that his willingness to invest in Goldman would itself stabilize market confidence. He was not just a buyer, he was a signal, and Goldman needed that signal more than it needed the $5 billion. What this means is that the crisis opportunity Buffett accessed in 2008 was not available to someone who decided in September of that year to start paying attention. It was available only because of decisions made across 40 years of prior behavior. The preparation was the access, and the access was the edge. This is the deeper problem that 3 centuries of wealth transfers all point toward, but that almost no financial education names directly. If the surface problem people focus on is, what should I buy when a crisis hits? That is a real question, and there are real answers to it. Quality over price, liquidity over convenience, solvency over appearance of solvency. But the deeper problem is earlier than all of that. It is the question of whether your pre-crisis positioning gives you any capacity to act at all when the window opens. The window is always short. In 1907, Morgan had days. In 2008, the most attractive deals closed within weeks of Lehman's collapse. The distressed prices that looked insane in October of 2008 looked merely cheap 6 months later, and looked like obvious missed opportunities by 2010. Buffett wrote about this in the New York Times in October 2008, while the crisis was still acute. His point was not that the opportunity was obvious. It was that most people, at precisely the moment when the opportunity was largest, were incapable of acting on it. Because they were dealing with their own financial distress, managing their own fear, or simply had no dry powder left. The people who recovered fastest were not the ones who made the best decisions in October of 2008. They were the ones who had made different decisions in 2005, 2006, 2007. Decisions that left them with options when the options mattered. The families and institutions that rebuilt most effectively after 2008 did so in different ways. Some held liquid assets, while some held assets in forms that didn't require institutional cooperation to access. Some had simply avoided leverage at a time when leverage was freely available and socially encouraged. The specific mechanism varied. The underlying logic was constant. They had preserved optionality during the boom. Optionality bought them access to the crisis. Access to the crisis bought them the transfer. This pattern, the crisis decision tree in practice, is not the playbook of people who are smarter than the crowd. It is the playbook of people who thought through a specific question before the crisis made the thinking impossible. The question is not, what should I do if markets fall? It is, if markets fall significantly tomorrow, what would I be able to do that most people around me could not? And if the honest answer to that question is nothing, The follow-up question is, what decisions made between now and then would change that answer? If that is worth understanding, and the next piece builds directly on it, looking at which asset classes have historically provided the optionality that made crisis access possible across different regimes. Like and subscribe. The next video changes how this one reads. Of the assets you currently hold, how many require an institution to remain cooperative before you can act with them? And how many would give you genuine room to move in a week when most people around you had none? Comment the number below. Then consider what it would take to change it.